This is about realizables, and as Frank very nicely explained, this is part of BFO, and this is the top part of BFO. BFO is itself a top-level ontology. This is the top of the very top, and we'll be interested primarily in specifically dependent continuants, and specifically in those specifically dependent continuants which are realizables. And for specifically dependent continuant, you can just read attribute, which is a vague term for what we try to define more precisely in BFO. So BFO is documented in this book, which came out a few years ago. We now have something of the order of 400 ontologies or ontology groups who are using BFO as the basis for their work, and it's expanding quite rapidly in the government area here in the US. And by government, I also mean intelligence and military, but also administration and so. So this is the starting point, and one important subkind of attributes is qualities. And qualities are defined by the fact that they're always realized, or they're realized whenever they exist. So if something is red, if something has the quality red, then it's always red. And then there are realizables, and realizables are defined by the fact that they're not always realizable. Not always realized when they exist. So a realizable entity is an attribute of some continuant entity that only realizes or becomes manifest or performs under certain conditions. And there are two kinds of realizables in BFO. Now, BFO never claims to be complete, so it may be that in the future there will be 3 kinds or 7 kinds. But currently we distinguish 2 kinds of realizable, namely roles on the one hand and dispositions on the other hand. And roles are attributes that you have. So we sometimes people play roles. We're interested in those cases where people have roles, such as the role of student, or the role of lawyer, or the role of traffic policeman. We're not interested in the role of playing Hamlet. That may be a kind of role in the relevant BFO sense, but then the relevant role would be the role of actor. You have the role of actor in order that you can play the role of Hamlet. But we're more interested today in dispositions, and those are physically grounded. That is to say, you have the dispositions that you have because you are made up, constituted physically in a certain way, as contrasted with roles, which you can have without changing your physical nature in any way. And dispositions are tendencies, potentials, real possibilities that an entity has because of its physical structure. So they go there. BFO dispositions and BFO roles are subkinds of BFO realized. Now, as I said, realizables need not be realized. Some realizables are never realized. But realizables typically are realized sometimes. Some realizables are realized at all times. For instance, the disposition of your heart to pump blood is, as long as you're alive, realized continuously. Now, realizations are types, and realization of a realizable occurs through a process, and each realizable entity type is thereby associated with a corresponding process type. For instance, the disposition to go bald with the process of losing hair, and so on. This holds both of dispositions and of roles. Now, the most important subkind of disposition which we've addressed in the literature so far is function. So we identify functions as dispositions. Remember that disposition is very general. It means any kind of real possibility. And it seems that if you have the function to do X, then there is a real possibility that you do X. And this is true whatever kind of entity we're talking about. If there is no real possibility to do X, then the entity in question does not have the function to do X. As long as there is a real possibility, then the entity has the function, even if it's not realizing or performing the function. Now, what is a function? Well, here we defend the etiological view of function. Your function is a matter of why you exist, the reason why you began to exist. And then there are two kinds of functions, artifact functions and biological functions. Artifact functions exist because of the way the entity was designed and built, and biological functions exist because of processes of selection which occurred in the ancestry of the entity, according to standard evolutionary theory. And again, every function is associated with a type of realizing process in the obvious way. And the name of the function is very closely related to the name of the realizing process, typically. So the process of the heart is to pump blood, and this is realized in a process of pumping. Okay, as I said, there are two kinds of function, and in both cases, we can understand the reason why we talk about functions, or the meaning of the term function, by thinking of the function as the reason for the existence of the entity which has it. Now, biologists hate it when you talk about reasons for existence in connection with selection, but it's still a reasonable algorithm for understanding what we mean by the function. Your heart exists because, for the reason that you need something to pump blood around your body. And similarly for all the other organs and for all the other functional parts of your body. And the reason account applies directly to artifacts. The reason this screwdriver exists is because we needed a tool to unscrew or screw. All right. So this is the definition of function. This is the selected effect theory, which has been popularized very cleverly by Ruth Millikan under the heading of proper function. So BFO sees this as the definition of function. Millikan uses proper function because many people speak of entities having functions even though they were not built or selected to have those functions. And we're not here talking about those improper function cases. We're only talking about proper function. And this is her definition, which is very complicated. I've simplified it somewhat. This is the definition, which is it's as complicated as it is in order to count for the biological case. So first of all, we define a reproduction as being a kind of offspring or copy which inherits properties from, particularly functions from, the copy or the reproducing starting entity. And then to say that an entity has a function f is to say that the entity originated as a reproduction from some prior entity, and it originated in part due to the fact that those properties which were realized in the past will now be realized in it. So in other words, if you want to reproduce yourself, then you want to reproduce yourself. I'm talking biologically now. If you want to reproduce yourself biologically, then you want to reproduce yourself in such a way that your descendants will be able to reproduce themselves. And that means that they need to stay alive. And that means that they need to have those body parts which are needed to stay alive. And that means that those body parts must have functions. And that means that those body parts must be able to realize those functions in the way that they were realized by their ancestors in the past. And all of that Millikan compresses into what is, for a philosopher, a very beautiful expression, but which will probably confuse ordinary speakers of English, that the copied entity exists because in the causally, historically sense of because of this or these realizations. All right, now that's the heart of what we're talking about here. Now, what kinds of entities can have functions? Well, organs, bodily systems, and so forth. Machines, any kind of artifact, practically speaking, will have a function. Almost because an artifact can very easily be defined as a material entity which exists because of the intention to reproduce or realize some function. Organizations have functions, and this includes also biological organizations, such as the organizations formed by colonial organisms. Colonial organisms have functions, but organisms in general do not have functions. So I do not have a function. I do not even have the function to do ontology. It may be that my function is to survive, or to reproduce, or to survive and to reproduce. But I find that, along with other biologists, less attractive than the view that it's your parts of your body which have the function. You yourself are just the bag in which the parts are contained. All right, so people never have functions. To make this reasonable, you can think of the following. My digestive system has the function to digest food, but it's not my function to eat. I am not here to eat. I'm not here to speak. I'm not here to do anything. However, my digestive system, because my digestive system has the function to digest food, and because it realizes that function, we can say of me that I have the capability to digest food. So I'm not here to digest food, but I can digest food. And it's in virtue of that fact that I am here and continue to be here. So this capability idea is very closely related to the function idea, but it's not the function idea. Now, BFO does not distinguish capabilities. Maybe we will in the future add the term capability to BFO. But the idea is that every function is a capability, and every capability is a disposition. Now, the very same entity, which is my digestive system, has both the function and the capability of digesting food. I have only the capability. What this means is that the terms function and capability are very often going to be used to tag the same data. And that's one of the reasons why it's not been seen to be a good idea thus far to integrate in BFO, because if an annotator has a choice between annotating with function and annotating with capability, there's very often going to be an uncertainty as to which choice to make. Okay, so this you've already seen. These are the kinds of entities which can have capabilities. Roughly, they're the same kinds of entities which can have functions, but they also include people, and they also include those many cases where artifacts and organizations acquire capabilities in the course of time without acquiring those functions. So there is a story according to which FedEx, which is an organization whose function is to transport packages, discovered by accident that it has had the capability to do logistics. And so when it realized that fact, it spun off a sub-organization whose function is logistics. So FedEx itself keeps its function. It discovers that it has a capability, and then it recognizes that that capability is a reason for the existence of a new entity, which is the FedEx spin-off company devoted to logistics. Now, similarly, you build a car, and you decide later that you would like the car to play music. That's not the function of the car, but you install a stereo system in your car to give it the capability to play music. It's not the proper function of the car to transport people, but it is the capability, to play music, but it is the capability of the car to play music. All right, and now they're building more and more safety features into cars. These are not functions of the car, they are capability. So now, how do we define capability? So we know how to define function. In the loose sense, it's the reason for existing of the relevant entity. But what is a capability? What is the extra character which is needed for a disposition to become a capability? Now, we've been a long time working out the answer to this question. We started with the idea of gradability. So the idea is that functions satisfy the principle that they can be graded on a scale of good or bad realization. And this is true of capabilities too. Capabilities can be graded on a scale of good or bad realization. So maybe we say that capabilities are all those dispositions which are gradable. Now, that didn't work for all kinds of reasons. It's true, we think, it's an axiom that we will almost certainly accept that all capabilities and therefore all dispositions are gradable. But we don't think that it's a good way to define capability. So we have this. I just note that there are many more capabilities than there are functions. And now the proposed definition is using the term interest in. So a disposition is a capability if we have an interest in its realizability. This is a very, very broad conception of what a capability is. But we believe that a capability is indeed a very broad term, that there are very many capabilities all over the place. And so the problem now is to elucidate what we mean by has an interest in. And we define it by stating the axioms which govern it. So interest in is connected with survival and with reproduction in the case of organisms. An organism has an interest in its own survival and reproduction. This is a kind of basic axiom. And therefore, it has an interest in the realization of the functions of all its parts. Now, we know that for many of our parts, and that's why we go to the doctor. But most organisms, of course, know nothing about the functionings of their parts, which means that having an interest in is not closely connected with knowledge. You can have an interest in, and you do, in fact, have an interest in millions of things without having any knowledge. Actually, trillions of things, because there are many molecules in your neurons. The second axiom is the axiom which says that you have a plan. Then it follows that you're interested in all the realizations prescribed by the plan. And again, we think this is fairly trivial. We hope that the biological axiom is very trivial. Now, the next axiom is less trivial. So, X has an interest in the realization of some disposition Y, and the realization of some disposition Z is required for the realization of Y. And we believe that it follows that X has an interest in the realization of Z. And the reason why this is somewhat problematic is because there are all kinds of weird realizations which are in the penumbra of any disposition that you have an interest in realizing. And it seems odd to make those to be capabilities also. But it works precisely because the idea of capability is very clear. And then the permanence axiom, this is the weakest axiom. We need this for convenience purposes. So if we don't have the the permanence axiom, then we will no longer be able to assert that all functions are capability. And this is because you may find an old gadget made of bronze by the ancient Greeks. You don't know what it's for, but it clearly was built for some reason. And maybe the reason is to grind a certain kind of seed which no longer exists, and no similar seed exists. Now, according to the etiological definition of function, this gadget still has the function of grinding seed of that sort. But it's rather unattractive to say that it also has the capability of grinding seed of that sort, because there are no more seeds of that sort. But nevertheless, we accept the permanence axiom because it doesn't do any harm, and it brings a huge benefit, which we can, namely that we can accept as a general axiom the thesis that every function is a capability.